backlighting. Now, probably the best way to... Okay, let's start with this photo. So I was talking about this photo last week when I was talking about the use of coloured gels. And what I said was the way this photo had worked, for those who weren't watching last week, was within this confined space. This is Doug Fitch, potter based in Corsica in southwest Scotland, and his wife, another potter, Fitch and MacAndrew. And the space itself is kind of a converted porter cabin, so there's not a huge amount of places to put lights. And I had a main front light coming from the left. But when you've just got a front light, all the light hits the subject, and then the back all kind of disappears into the shadow. But the background of this was an important aspect of the photo. But also what I wanted to do was, rather than just light it up, there was a tiny little window which you can just sort of see behind Doug's head there. Now, it was just a few feet away from a wall where very little natural light was actually coming in. So what I did was I stuck an off-camera flash, a speed light on a stand, put it through a diffusing umbrella, and I put an orange gel on it. And the orange gel then kind of cuts through, and the effect you get is one of a kind of late evening sun coming through in the background. So it was a nice kind of warming effect. It helped light up the background. But it also, part of it is catching Doug's hair here as well. And that notion of a light behind the subject is what I mean when I was talking about the idea of the photographer's secret weapon. An awful lot of... It's one of those things I don't often see talked about. I certainly don't see it talked about enough. You'll hear all these different things with photography about rule of thirds, of, different kind of compositional techniques, or understanding your aperture and your ISO and your shutter speed, and all these things. They're fine, they're relevant. But I think when it comes to lighting, the use of backlighting, when done properly, can just lift. It really lifts the image to another level. Now, sometimes the people who really know this are live performances, right? When you go and watch a band live, you go to the stadium, you go to the theatres as well. I mean, visual experience. They nearly all have a rack of lights behind them. They're not just being lit from the front, they are also being lit from behind. And they know it just looks much more amazing when they do. So, for example, here's a photo, status quo. And fine, he's got the main lights on him, but he does have lights coming down from behind. And when you're back out there watching this, what the backlight really does is it separates the person from the background. When you don't have a backlight, when it's just sort of fades into the black, well, there isn't the separation. It just sort of blends in, and it just sort of... Whereas the moment you've got a light behind and it's catching the edge of the hair or catching the shoulder, then it separates from the background, and it kind of makes the foreground part of the image just pop, really. And given the fact that what we are working with is a two-dimensional medium, trying to capture a three-dimensional space, the use of that backlight helps create that three dimensions, because you become aware of the separation. You become aware then much more of the depth of the picture. The background is now something much further back. Much more. Sometimes they use smoke, sometimes you get silhouettes, and you can maybe end up with something like this. This is King Charles was playing at the Eden Festival a couple of years back. And again, there's another aspect to this, which, as well as visually it looks great for you, when everybody whips out their phones and cameras when they're in the audience and starts taking photos, the photos just look great. There's there's a whole understanding in performance, and especially things like festivals and what have you, where if people go and, you go off to your music festival, you take loads of photos. The photos that look best are going to be the ones that you stick up on Facebook and other social media to share. And you could have the greatest musician, who does the most heart-wrenching singer-songwriter stuff, would make you weep. But if the stage looks pretty bland, if the lighting is pretty bland, then the photos end up pretty bland. And you might stick the photo up saying, hey, saw this guy, oh, his voice was just moved me to tears. But the photos just get overlooked, and somebody zooming past them in their social media feeds will just go past because they might not even bother to read how wonderful a singer this person was because the photo wasn't interesting. So a lot of bands realised quite quickly that if you've got a really good visual, then what happens is people take photos, and these are the photos that then get shared more. Because they automatically look good, everybody's sharing them in their Facebook and their Instagram and whatever other social media feeds they've got. And so your name spreads further. Setting up good lighting then is a really, really important part of any stage performance. And the backlighting, most lighting specialists in theatres and stages really understand this. Then there's the notion of sort of putting in a bit of dry ice or smoke, and you then get these wonderful kind of shadow effects and streaks coming through it. In a few weeks' time, I'm planning on talking about the use of smoke in images, so make sure you stick around for that. But this just sort of gives you a sense of what's going on. Another one, even this one where Bellowhead were playing, fun group. Again, you've a little bit of smoke, but really the main thing here is the backlighting, where that light is creating this halo around his head and then catching the edge of the tuba. It just makes him pop out of the background. So it's a really powerful kind of effect. Now you can play. Sometimes you can play. If you're at least when you're using the sun. Let's do this one. If you're using the sun as a backlight, of course the next problem is that generally speaking the foreground gets thrown into silhouette. But you can play with that notion. Here I was out with this photographer Alan Wright. He's a wonderful landscape photographer, and we'd gone out together just to sort of play around and sort of catch a bit of the setting sun. And I took this photo of him getting ready with his camera, and I really quite like that silhouette. So you can as long as you get the silhouette right, you get the shapes right, you can see that here's a man, profile on, and you can see the camera. A little bit of lens flare coming across the silhouette. But there are times also I was doing some photography for Absolute Classics, who arrange all sorts of classical performers to come and play in Dumfries and Galloway and different places. And I was photographing their rehearsal, and here I had lights set up, and one of the lights, the light that should have been lighting her up, didn't go off, but the backlight did. And it just creates this beautiful sort of line around. I really like these kind of photos. They're incredibly atmospheric. You can't see the detail. You're just getting the detail on the edging. You're not seeing her face or anything. But the mind fills in the spaces. And so it's almost like a kind of chalk line on a piece of black paper. Another one from the same shoot where I was using wide angle lens at this point. Now the backlight is lighting up more. You can see the piano. You're catching the face of the guy sitting next to her. You're catching a violin player. This is classical music. It's a violin player, not a fiddle player. in there, and there's lots of lines and shapes coming out. We've also got the kind of streaks of light coming as well, and so that's got quite a lot more energy in it, use of diagonals and what have you in there. But this notion then that this backlight is just that's what's really creating the power in these photos. So, but if we go back to this problem of if you've got the sun behind you, you end up with a silhouette, like there was with this photo of Alan. Then what do you do when you're photographing someone like Polly? Here, because what we've got is we've got the setting sun behind her, which is creating this absolutely beautiful halo, this lovely edging on the sheep, and separating her out from the background, those spring trees in the back. I think this was mid-April-ish, thereabouts. So the leaves were just starting to come out on the trees. So what I had to do here was I actually had to use the flash as a fill light. So I'm using the sun as the backlight, and off to the right of the picture, so just outside on the right, I've got a flash speed light on a stand, and then that's lighting her up. If I didn't have that, she and the sheep would just be a silhouette. And of course then you wouldn't have the wonderful expression and be able to see the chicken so well, or really work out what was going on. So by having an off-camera flash, I was able to fill in the gap. So in terms of exposure, you expose for the ambient situation, you expose for the background, and then you change the power on the flash in order to fill in as much, so you don't white her out, or she's not left in shadow. If you ever, the trick for ever knowing how a lighting setup is follow the shadows, or follow backwards from the shadows. And you'll notice in here that basically, if all the sun was just coming from behind her, then you wouldn't have this side of the rocks lit up, and this is where the bag is lit up. And if you then look at the shadow of the buckle on the bag, you can then sort of run that backwards and find where the lighting is. So that's really the notion of backlighting. Look out for opportunities. If you have multiple speed lights or flashes which you can place around, then you should always be looking to have one behind the subject. If you've only got one, then use ambient light as well. In this case, I'm just using one flash. I'm lighting her and using the sun as a backlight. You can do it the other way around, where you're using the sun as the main light, but then you've got another backlight happening. But for me, is one of the most powerful lighting techniques there is. And if you've not already played with it, then play with it. Absolutely play with it. Another thing you can do, in fact, I really should have lined this one up. It's only just occurred to me now as a great example of a photo where I was using the backlight, and in fact I didn't have any flashes. Yes, here we go. This photo. So this photo of Amber in a bluebell wood on her pony, and in essence what we've got is we've got the sun coming through the trees and lighting her up from behind. Now this Alan Wright, the landscape photographer I was talking about earlier, and silhouetted against the setting sun, he was helping me out with this because Amber is his daughter, and at this point Alan was holding up a reflector. So by the sunlight was coming past Amber and then hitting the reflector and bouncing back, and that created the fill light, so it stopped Amber being lost completely in silhouette. So even if you don't have an off-camera flash, the use of a reflector to bounce light about can be an effective use of to get the lighting how you want it to. So that's really what I wanted to talk about with backlighting. If you've not tried it, if you've not really thought about it, experiment with it, go for it, because I guarantee once you start mastering the use of backlight, you will find that your photography just shifts up to another level. If you found this useful, let your friends know and hit subscribe.